Welcome to Exploring Axon, a podcast where we discuss Axon Framework, Axon Server, and their ecosystem. I am your host and the producer of this podcast, Sarah Torrey. Welcome to the second portion of my talk with Dominic. In this portion of our conversation, we talked about how attribute-based access control can be used to secure Axon applications. He explained about the Spring Boot integration and Axon command side and the query side. He talked about the annotation that he has introduced in his framework that integrates very nicely with Axon framework. He also talked about integration and the ways it can be deployed and what kinds of support are offered for authoring of policies. Dominic talked about this topic during our conference in September of last year in Amsterdam. I will include the link to that presentation in the notes as well as some other helpful information. I hope you enjoyed the second portion, and let's have a listen. Now, as promised, I wanted to go back and talk a little bit about Axon and how you came to basically know about Axon and kind of started your journey and knowing more about Axon framework and so on. So let's go back to maybe the sort of intro part of things. You did mention that you are partnering with Axon. So tell me a little bit about that, a bit more, and why Axon, and maybe even more high level than that, why domain-driven design? Let's maybe start with that.
For me, my start was actually related to the access control domain, but it was very pragmatic because in the late 2000s, we were starting a project in the IoT space, working with Sandvik Coromant, which is now Bosch, Volvo Construction, monitoring their fleets of construction robots. And no, Sandvik Coromant is not Bosch, that was Hägglunds Drives.
Gotcha.
Which was a hydraulic motor. Sorry for the mix-up. And we're basically monitoring fleets of machines, also software processes in parts, with raw sensor data coming in. And there were cross-organizational collaboration scenarios where people and engineers would work with external experts, and they needed to do these dynamic projection of real-time data based on their models and change that at runtime to find problems. Mm-hmm. So, and what we did back then was writing collaborative applications for that, which were using social graphs as modeling the organizational structures of the different teams interacting with each other. Mm-hmm. And back then, we said, oh yeah, let's just use XSCML for access control. We can basically express that a lot of stuff with that and go for it. And we quickly found out that that was not really working so well for us because our social graphs were using semantic web technologies, triple stores were graph-like, and you had to do type inference and all that kind of good stuff. Mm-hmm. And it was difficult to use with XACML. And one of the sub-problems was how to express this graph in how to persist it and to make it efficiently queryable. How to make efficient queries against this model. Mm-hmm. And we had a semantic idea how this domain should be structured. But what backend, which triple store or graph database or something proprietary in memory would be efficient for accessing this model was unclear. And I already had written the logic for changing this model 3 times. And I said, I don't want to do that again. And I found the pattern of CQRS, and thought, okay, let's just write the command side once and just add different backends for querying to see which ones work best. And then I was right about writing my own CQRS framework when I discovered that Axon was available, and some guy in the Netherlands has already written quite a lot of that.
So
So
how did you
that's
come to that discovery? Was it just an accidental discovery, or did somebody
it was in the
mention it?
process of learning about the patterns, because I found out about the pattern and I thought
Yep.
that would be a good fit, that I don't need to write this command set 10
Hmm.
times to experiment with different backends.
Yep.
And then in the process, I stumbled upon it with
Nice.
all the
And
different
then,
talks about event store and so on.
right. And why would reinvent the wheel if somebody else already done
Yeah,
the heavy
because that
lifting
was
in the way?
exactly, and
Right.
that was not my focus, right? I had a goal in mind that
Exactly.
I wanted to solve, um,
Yes.
which then led to me really liking that framework as it was back then, which is
Yeah.
already, I think that were the early days of Axon, with where there only was the Google group for discussion and so on for
Yes. It was
Axonic.
a while ago. Yeah.
And
Not
yeah,
too
I
too
wrote
long
some
ago, but still a
applications.
while ago. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, and as I'm also teaching at the university, I have to teach a practical course every winter semester, and I started using that with my students, introduced them to the framework, and we had some fun.
Neat. Yeah.
Used it also for recently for very different things, um, like we implemented a production assistance system for additive manufacturing, where the entire
Okay.
backend is Axon implemented, and we have an augmented reality HoloLens front end coupled to it.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yes, so that's really what I did. And parallel, I was doing the research on access control. And then just recently, when all the things of that research came to a point where I said, now that's really already practical. We can deploy it in production. That's usable in Spring Boot applications, for example. I said, okay, now let's go back and close the loop and also do a deep Axon framework integration.
And so what you basically ended up doing also was in that process, you sort of created, ended up creating somewhat of a framework on top of Axon in order to gain what you were trying to do in terms of access control. So let's dig a little bit deeper into that. I know you have introduced some of the annotations during your talk. So can we talk a little bit about that and how you can use it on the command side and the query side? And of course, you
Mhm.
did mention this Spring Boot integration as well. If you'd like to go a little bit deeper into that.
Yeah, so maybe I start here at the beginning. So what I ended up doing was I ended up disliking XACML so much that I said, no, the developer experience was so not enjoyable for
Mm.
myself. We really ended up writing authoring tools for these XML policies and so on. And some policies we wanted to express were not expressible at all. So
Ah, okay.
I just ended up then, how it always is, inventing my own, writing my
Do
own,
it yourself. If you want something done right,
um,
do it yourself. Exactly.
designing a new policy language, which is,
Mhm.
I think, much more human readable and writable than something like ZACML.
Yeah.
And with that comes, of course, it's nice to have a language, but you also need the tools to use it. So
Right.
this comes with all the things you need. And we have been writing this thing for, in the incarnation we have now, the code goes back now about 5 years, the code base.
Oh, wow.
So
Great.
it's a complete engine with a policy decision point, with a server for policy decision point libraries to embed them into Java applications, interfaces to extend it. We have code editors with auto completion. We have an complete web-based IDE for developing
Nice.
policies in the make, which is going to be released soon. And that's nice. Now you have the PDP and you have a language and the tools and you can write it. But what my experience was is that that's completely useless if you do not take care about developer experience.
Yeah,
So he's
right.
in the
And
end.
that was the reason in the first place. Yeah, because you didn't have
Yeah,
a good
because
experience. Yeah,
that was exactly the pain point,
yeah,
because I had a terrible developer experience.
yeah.
And that's
Exactly. Yeah.
something I wanted to counter, and I wanted to be able to not litter the code with a lot of access control code, but do it in the same kind of declarative style that all the simple models like ABAC are supported by frameworks like Spring Boot. Do it in the same style, support
Right.
the natural way of developing your business application without getting into the way of the developer and making it possible for the developer to get started quickly. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, with these kinds of complex frameworks, you can always go as deep as you like and make your life as complicated as you like, or maybe the
Of
domain is
course.
doing that for you already.
Right.
Um, but just getting started compared to what we had there was now the goal to have this developer experience, and we started with a Spring Boot integration. So
Right.
just like you would have the existing annotations like pre-authorize, we would have something like pre-enforce or
Mm,
post-enforce.
gotcha.
And then automatically a proxy bean is created and a policy enforcement point is wrapped around the method call.
Mm,
And at the
nice.
same time, we were switching the basic patterns around a little bit, because traditional ABAC is request response based, and we changed everything up to be publish subscribe based. So you would not send an authorization request with your question if the permission is there, but you would subscribe to the answers. So it would be a subscription. And
Mm-hmm.
this also allowed us to do a deep integration with Project Reactor and the WebFlux
Nice.
framework of Spring Boot, so that
Yeah.
we now can do access control on, for example, a Flux, which is in Reactor a stream of events instead of just
Mm-hmm.
returning a list. It's an asynchronous occurring stream of events. And we can do runtime modification, can do, okay, while there is no access, give the client information that there is no access, but still stay subscribed. And as soon as access is established, sends the events,
Mm-hmm.
or um, send the events until there is no longer an access decision. And you can do this. And also these but things, these side notes.
The
At the
favorite
same
side
time,
notes.
these
Yes.
yeah, this is some data about a patient, and we update it. Please modify it and classify it before sending it to the customer, to the
Mm.
client. So instead of having the raw sensor data, you would already make it a little, yeah, little more specific, or you could say, instead of sending a birth date, map this to an age range to preserve some
Mm-hmm.
sort of privacy in larger
Right.
data sets.
Yeah,
And you
makes
can
sense.
change all of that at runtime. And that's exact. And how you do that is just by putting an annotation on top of a method, returning an object, returning this kind of data stream. It's this return type flux in the angle brackets with the event type. And these kinds of endpoints would be automatically deployed. And after we succeeded with that, and there's an open library for that available for you
Mm-hmm.
to use already, we said, now let's go the next step, because we're using Axon, as I said, in some of our projects. Let's
Right.
secure those models as well.
Yep.
And as you and your audience knows very well, that is a very different way of thinking and interacting with services and doing queries.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
Yep.
usually not done with just annotating a repository method.
Right.
You have to think about the domain, about aggregates. You have to think about command and query separately. And we developed a similar approach as with the Spring Boot integration for Axon, where you can establish policy enforcement points in aggregates and the command handling, and with a query handler method and subscription queries as well, which would
Right.
be written in a very similar declarative way.
Yeah, which is really easy to follow as well. And as I mentioned, I will link in the talk that you had, and it has some code samples there. But um, just one thing that I was wondering: so the annotation that you put in for these pre-handle enforcement, do they usually come prior to the command handler or after the command handler annotation, or does it matter? I'm assuming it's, from what I remember, I think it comes after the command handler annotation.
I think it's not really relevant.
Doesn't matter.
I just have a style preference. I
Yeah.
like to sort annotations regarding to string length, just because they are much easier to read.
Exactly
If
right.
there's no implied semantics on the sequence.
Yeah.
But that's about anything
That's
I
just a
would say
personal preference.
anybody. That's just a
Gotcha.
personal preference.
Right.
I like my code to look nice. So
Right. It would be nice to have it clean and readable, which is great.
not
But
trying
in
to
terms of
start a war on that.
yes, God forbid. But
No,
in terms of functionality, it really doesn't matter. It can go before or
no.
after.
But what you can think about is when is the execution time of the
Mm.
policy enforcement. So,
Mhm.
for example, in the Spring annotations, you have this pre-enforce and post-enforce,
Right.
which means do the decision before or after invoking the method.
Right.
And there is a good indication on why you would do that. For
Mhm.
example, if you query something and the attributes you need to make the decision are only in the query result, you have to use this result to build your authorization question. So, and if we're talking about the command handling side on Axon, this post enforcement does not make sense, in my opinion.
Right.
So, it's always before doing the execution of the command handler. And the good thing is that the way we implement it is that you, at the point where the execution of the policy enforcement point is, that's exactly after the replay of the aggregate has happened. So we have the
Mhm.
current state. And because we are inside the aggregate and in the same unit of work as the command handler, we can now do anything you could do in a command handler. So you
Nice.
can emit additional events. You can
Mhm.
access the state of the aggregate. Because what do you use the state of the aggregate for? It's this consistency boundary. You make a decision in the command handler before you do the action. If I do that, is the model consistent? And
Mhm.
basically,
Exactly.
access control is an additional way of looking at exactly this question. Will I end up in a consistent model with regards to my domain requirements? And this
Mhm.
one is looking at the requirements from access control.
Right.
And the annotations can use a Spring expression language to access the different attributes of the aggregate, so the member variables,
Mhm.
and then include them into the authorization question and use them directly. So this need you would have in a query model with executing the enforcement after the method is not
Mhm.
there because you already have the state available that you could need before doing that. So for the
Exactly.
command side, we just need the one annotation.
Which is the pre-handle. Yeah.
And the fun stuff is that, again, with the but, while you can have
Right.
some global services that can be triggered and you can do side effects, you can also use these but conditions in a way that you can include the logic for them in your aggregate code itself. So you can
Nice.
annotate methods of your aggregate class to be a constraint handler, and they can then be triggered by something coming out of the policy decision point. I think it's not
Mhm.
important how that works mechanically and how that's
Yeah.
expressed here without looking at some code. But you have means of expressing yes or no, but. And then this code path can be triggered, and that can do anything you could do in a command handler.
Right.
So you have an additional command handler, and these additional conditions are something like, you could think about them as additional commands to the aggregate that are coming from the policy decision point semantically.
Gotcha. Very, very nice. Now we did talk a bit about Spring Boot as well. Now, do folks have to use Spring Boot to be able to use the language and the framework, or is it not a prerequisite, or is it just to make your life easier to use Spring Boot?
Yeah, you don't have to. So it's very modular. So you can use the policy engine with the interpreter for the policies raw against some APIs and implement all this enforcement logic yourself if you want to. I would advise against doing that because there are a lot of intricacies like this but we always mention.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Doing this correctly is a lot of code. And if you hardwire some conditions, you may not be ready to interpret arbitrary decisions from the PDP.
Yes.
So I would recommend getting someone or getting a team together that writes a generic integration for the framework you are using.
Yep. Revert back to yeah, go ahead.
If you want to use the Axon integration, that currently has a direct dependency on Spring Security because it comes with some utilities like command or query interceptors that get the subject information from the current session, so to speak, and make that available and get that into the metadata of the commands and queries that the subject is captured. And also it enables you to do a hybrid implementation where you can use the Axon policy enforcement alongside the Spring Boot enforcement. Because I know many projects where Axon is completely used for the command side, but queries are not handled through the query bus, for example. And you go directly against a Mongo repository, for example. And then you could use the Spring Boot integration to annotate your Mongo repository methods and to secure them. So you can work in tandem there.
Yeah, exactly. And as we were talking about it, revert back to 15 minutes ago when we were talking about, is that your goal to write all of these policies and everything on your own, or just use a couple of frameworks to just get you going with your end goal, which is just working on an application or working on your domain? And that user experience, is it nice, or is it, you want to
others are to judge how nice it is. I think personally, I like it this way.
I like it.
And,
yes.
And developer experience is usually a key requirement when designing everything.
Yeah.
With developers, there's always a spectrum of taste and patterns that are preferred. So it's not likely that's of the taste of everybody. But I think it's in the spirit of this declarative style that's employed in Spring generally. And if you like that style of working, that should be right down your alley.
Yeah, exactly. So, Dominic, we did cover quite a bit on the command side of things, especially when it comes to Axon. So can you tell me a little bit on the query side as well? And why should we use the attribute-based access control on the query side, or is it useful, useless? So just kind of run me through it.
Well, the query side is really interesting because here you have to do a little bit more than just to decide if a manipulation is allowed or not. Like on the command side, you really have to think about of all the data I'm exposing, should I expose this incomplete form, or should I filter out certain elements? Or if I'm returning a collection of elements, do these have to be manipulated? Do I have to remove elements from this stream of elements, for example? And what even happens when I'm doing something like subscription query? So overall, you have the same authorization question again, like on the command side. You have the subject, the user or the client that's trying to perform an action, which would be the query, get the data, read the data, and then the resource would be the data set or a particular piece of data itself. So there you can have the same degree of flexibility as on the command side with regards to formulating a very domain focused and in your domain language given authorization question instead of going very generic.
Right.
So, and when using SAPL, for example, you have, and especially with Axon, you have two ways to go basically. The one hand, in Axon generally, you can choose if you want to use the Axon query bus facilities to access your query side, or if you have used your projections to build a database and you directly query the database by other means, which are both valid choices in designing an Axon application. If you would do the latter and say, yeah, we just access the database directly, and if you're in the Spring Boot world, you can use the Spring Boot integration of SAPL, which gives you a number of annotations that can attach policy enforcement points to arbitrary methods, and then you can do filtering and access control, and you can enforce different obligations and advice during the access control. And also it supports things like reactive data types like flux and monos to subscribe to data streams and to manipulate the data stream at runtime and to stay subscribed. And this is also one of the major differentiating things that SAPL does compared to things like XACML, because they would have just this query response scheme of here's the authorization question, give me one decision and be done. In this case, if you're dealing with these reactive data streams in a Flux, or let's say a WebSocket or an MQTT stream of events, you have a long-standing connection, and during the established connection and after the subscription has been done, the permissions may actually change, or the obligations that have to be enforced. And this is something that SAPL supports you in. So if you don't use the Axon query bus, you just use the Spring Boot integration and you're done.
Right.
For the Axon integration, this is a little bit more complicated from an architecture point of view, not from the implementation point of view, because Axon provides this location transparency. Because the client sends the message and you don't know where this is going to be enforced.
Exactly.
So you have to transfer the notion of the subject with a query. So with a query, you of course holds true for the command side. I haven't talked in that scope about that. You have to capture the subject and add it to the command or query metadata, and then send it. And in the microservice, or however you have built it in your monolith, in the structured monolith, you have to decide in the query model then how to handle it.
So the handling side, basically, then when it gets a little bit more complex, right?
Yeah, and here you can just annotate your query handler methods on the one hand. So you would have matching annotations. you would add to your query handler methods that would then establish this kind of policy enforcement point on the query side. And there again, we support multiple modes, where one, for example, also would be more than one. We have 3 modes for that. Some of them also do support streaming queries, subscription queries.
Very cool. Yeah.
So where you also have the same thing as with the Flux in general, where you have a long-standing connection, and during this connection, the conditions may change. There's also another interesting thing that you can do on the query side here compared to the command side, where the command side is generally, you really have to check before the command handler is invoked.
Okay.
And then invoke the command handler if you had the permission. In case of a query handler, to have the knowledge about a potential resource you would like to access, to formulate your authorization question, you may have to invoke the query handler first, get the resource from the back end to be able to express your authorization question. For example, if there's a patient that's assigned to a ward in a hospital, then this may be relevant for the authorization process, that only the staff of that ward may deal with the data of the patient. So you would have to add this to the patient data. And that you can only do after you already retrieved your patient resource from the database.
Right.
So it's really a question of what you want to do there and what you need to formulate your question.
And then, as you mentioned with the subscription query, for instance, if you are using this kind of data, and in this example, if another ward needs to access the data as well, then would you then do this authorization prior to basically activating the query handler, or does it happen afterwards? Or is it my favorite answer of it depends?
Yeah, it depends. So I can make you happy there with the answer. It's just usually I would say it is the sensible default to do it before you invoke it. Because if the permission is not granted, you do not waste the resources on performing the query to your database or however you have stored it. So that would be the sensible way of doing it if that's not necessary. Sure. But if you need the data from the resource, then of course it makes sense to do it afterwards. There are different annotations you would select to explicitly tell the engine when to do the enforcement.
Makes sense.
So
very good.
In essence, this is also completely transparent for the client side. So the client would never need to have any dependencies on this kind of policy engine, besides maybe a small utility that puts the subject into the metadata, that you could do that by yourself or use a library for that. There's one scenario where this is a little bit more complicated, where not really complicated, but there's a use case when you're dealing with subscription queries where you can decide, so, okay, now I have this long-standing subscription and I have a stream of decisions. How do I link those together?
Gotcha. Okay.
So the first and the default scenario would be, okay, I'm asking for permission. If the permission is granted, I will send the stream of updates and the initial result. And as soon as I get a deny from the policy engine, I will throw an access denied exception, terminate the subscription, and be done.
Right.
So, but what's about, I still would like to stay subscribed. So there are two ways of doing that. On the one hand, you could say, I stay subscribed, and as long as I do not have a permission, the query side just drops all messages.
Okay.
So just any event that happens in between, is dropped, and then you don't leak this information. That's also fine. And those two modes are completely transparent. You don't have to do anything to achieve that on the client side. But there's a third mode that could be very relevant, which is, okay, now there is a access denied message, but I would like to stay subscribed, and I would like to be aware if I'm currently denied access or not. So for example, if you're rendering a user interface and you're monitoring, let's stick with the hospital scenario, you have monitoring of some vital signs of the patient, that your UI shows you, yeah, you do not have access to these vital signs. And now you get permission, and then it starts rendering it. You lose permission, and it can show you that you don't have access, and you don't need to query again and again and pull it. It's handled there. And there you have to do a little bit more, because this extends the semantics of the traditional subscription query, because normally if you go for an Axon subscription query, it will be terminated on any error. And you have to wrap these messages differently and have to provide some tooling to be able to have these kinds of recoverable access errors. That's also supported. And
so
what
in
you
this
can
case,
do
then
with
would
all
you...
of...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's fine.
I jumped in. No, go ahead. Maybe this will answer my question.
Oh, and what you can do with all of these scenarios, either if it's a simple query with a request response or subscription query to the decisions, you can add arbitrary obligations, and there are hooks that allow you, on the one hand, for example, to modify the query before it is really evaluated, before it's handed over to the query handler. For example, if there's a query that says, I want the data from 1930 till 2010, but the permission is only, you only have the license to get at most 10 years of data, then such an obligation could dynamically degrade the service and change the query accordingly. Or if you have any results, there are tools for removing data elements from a query response, for modifying it. For example, if you have credit card information in it and you want to render it for your user interface, which may be JavaScript based, you don't want to send the entire credit card number to the user interface, but only these first four numbers that the user can identify which credit card it is. The rest should be blackened. So you could dynamically blacken parts of strings and completely modify data structures in flight. And could also from streams remove elements and so on.
Very nice. I did have one question about what you had mentioned on the third implementation option, basically, when you have the subscription query and if you get the access denied. In that case, if you are receiving your real-time updates, right? But at one point you are not allowed to access the data anymore, right? Would you then continuously get these access denied notifications, or in that case, you can basically implement how you want to receive your response and say, okay, I don't want to receive these access denied messages or so on. And then once the, let's say the query is available and the updates can be accessed again, then we will just start automatically. How do you implement that, basically?
So in case the client wants to react on this, the client has to use a special query bus implementation, not a query bus, a query gateway implementation that we supply as a small library, which is unwrapping these events. So what the process would be, you get your normal updates, and then you get an error, which would be an error in a flux. And then you can use matching tools to recover from the error if you want. And because of that, this unwrapping happens in this dedicated query gateway, that is possible. Also, you can register matching listeners to these errors.
Gotcha.
And the flow is that you receive the access deny message and then nothing until you get a permit message. And then the events start flowing again.
Flowing again. Very good.
So
very good. Makes sense.
if you do not want to react on it, and on the query side, on the query handler, there is the annotation that would support this kind of recoverability, but you don't use it and you just use the default gateway. It just falls back to one of the other strategies, and you don't have to worry about it if you don't want to consume it. So it's really robust against this. But if you have the knowledge that this may be supported because your client wants to react on this kind of thing, you can.
Yeah, very good. Nice. So let's go back to the deployment. You did talk a bit about it, but let's maybe dig a little bit deeper into some of the points that you were mentioning. For instance, the embedded PDP and the dedicated PDP server, and also the CI/CD pipeline.
Sure. So where do we start? Okay, we have
I know too many things all at once.
Yes, it's a lot, but it's no problem. When you're developing an application and you're using a JVM language, you can have the choice of using the policy engine directly and linking this interpreter and engine into your code as a Maven or Gradle dependency so that it will be bundled with the executable. Right. Or you can use a dedicated PDP server where you deploy your policies and use a simple API to consume that. The framework integrations we have use an interface against the PDP, and they don't care if you're using the embedded one or the remote one. So your code will look the same. It's just a matter of configuration and preference if you want to have the engine inside the executable or if you want to do it centrally with some network round trip. And for the embedded one, you have again two choices. You can either treat your policies just like part of your code base of your application and put them in a special folder of your program resources, just like you would do your application YAML or properties files or static web files, put them in the resources folder, and you're done. And then you have the advantage that you can ship it in the same process as your code. You can write policy tests just alongside your normal unit tests. And it's easy. The disadvantage is that you cannot change the policies at runtime. If you want to do that, you can configure it to say, okay, yes, I built a Docker container and there's a data volume, and this folder on the data volume, we put our policies, and the engine will automatically monitor this folder for changes and adjust decisions at runtime if these policies change. So, and for the server, we have two versions. We have a very simple headless one for these kinds of Kubernetes deployments where you are dealing with a lot of little pods and you want to don't necessarily want to have complex UIs. That's also just a server that acts in the same way, monitoring data volume with the policies and will update the clients at runtime. No need to restart anything if you change policies. And we have a PDP server where the policies are stored in a relational database, which also comes with a web UI where you can use a web-based policy editor for our policy language, SAPL, which also comes with features like available documentation of function libraries and external attributes, as well as code completion features and so on.
Right.
So, and then you mentioned these kind of
CI/CD pipelines.
CI pipelines. So that's one one way of thinking, or what's the motivation here? So we earlier talked about this kind of separation of concerns and looking at which team is responsible for what in your application and infrastructure deployment. Factor out the administration of policies easily. So also with XAML, you usually have an authorization server. There you write all your policies and store them. What you rarely get is some kind of formal verification if your policy is working as intended. And also with SAPL, there is no means of doing this formally, but we treat policies just as code. Mm-hmm. So, and what we have is a set of libraries where you can write unit tests in Java for your policies to verify if they fulfill the requirements. This also comes with a Maven plugin that where you can define quality gates regarding are the tests fulfilled, do I have the right code coverage, and with code coverage we also analyze in the rules and the policies which are already triggered by your tests. So you end up with an HTML report like you get in Eclipse or IntelliJ, showing you yellow, green, or red what the coverage of your code base now regarding the policies is. So, and if you have this kind of project, you can have, for example, in your source management tool, say Git, you can manage this kind of policy project alongside policy tests, and then use this to drive the updating of your policy decision point. So you have something like GitHub Action, Jenkins, or whatever your CI pipeline of choice is. And you can say, yeah, run these tests. If these are in staging or already in production, then do this or that, move this to the other branch, push it to production, push it to test. And you can atomically update the data volume, for example, of your PDP servers or even of your embedded PDPs. So you can implement a very, I think, natural way of updating and managing these policies in a typical CI/CD environment. Of course, these are complex by themselves, but exactly. It doesn't add a significant additional complexity. You just can use the tools you're using anyhow to manage your infrastructure.
Yeah.
And there's something that we're developing right now is that we have an integrated IDE for these kinds of projects where you would have a Visual Studio-based, Gitpod-based development environment with a code editor for SAPL, with a testing tool where you can live edit requests and see outcomes, link that to your live information points and to test it and to write your tests in.
Really neat. That's really great. So, and thank you for covering the support for, the kind of support that you offer as well. So we did talk a lot about why attribute-based access control is important and it's good, and how to basically implement it and so on. Can we maybe touch on some of the cons here as well? I like to kind of not always talk about the rainbows and unicorns, but maybe sort of like real life complexity and, is there an issue with performance and some of the other maybe cons that it may have?
Yes, of course. I think there are three main cons to this approach. I think I touched a little bit on it earlier when I said, if ABAC and role-based access control works for you and you do not have any of this complexity and you're happy, don't bother.
Don't worry about it. Exactly, right.
So, but if your domain has a certain complexity and you do not want to do it all by hand in your code, in your domain model, and this is some orthogonal requirement to the main processes. So what do you get with it? Of course, the approach is complexer than writing an ABAC model. You have to learn a policy language. Yep. The tooling is there. Like I said, we try to make this as easy as possible as we can.
Right.
But it's quite a learning curve to get started with that.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's not much different than, okay, do we write the code ourselves or do we use something like Spring Boot or Axon? It's really just
I think there's a learning curve in anything. Exactly. Yeah. I think whether you do it yourself or you're learning a tool, there's always some learning curve that's involved, for sure.
Exactly. So, and then of course, because it's complex and it can do much more and it's more involved, there comes a performance hit. Mm-hmm. And this really depends. You can do locally a significant 5-digit number of decisions easily. But if your rules are complex and you have a lot of rules, then that may become a bottleneck at some point. We have some fancy indexing algorithms and so on to make this more performant and in-RAM caching and so on. But basically, yes, it's a performance hit. And then you have to take into account the usual thing you would have with something like Axon as well. If you're delegating something to the infrastructure, sending a query in Axon, using Axon server, routing that, coming back, you have the network round trip. The same issue, you end up with a dedicated PDP server. You have to send a question and you have a certain latency till you get the first decision. However, the advantage is, just like with subscription queries in Axon, as it's a subscription, if there's later an update to that, you get this quasi immediately.
Yes, real-time update. Which is great.
So if you have this continuous monitoring of a permission, that's more performant in Axon.
Right.
And again, you can choose with regards to your requirement if you want to do this network round trip or you would prefer an embedded PDP and push the policies there. It's really, you can do what you like there. We try to not get into your way and make everything easy, but there is a performance hit. That's clear.
Yeah.
Then you have the issue of ability. Mm-hmm. We do not have, and the ZACML guys also don't have formal proving tools for correctness policies. So it's not provable, but it's testable. So we address it just like code because we say these are complex things. We have seen provable access controls models, which end up to be very formal and difficult to write also with regards to the policy, which puts a barrier between the developer and the stakeholders when communicating about the access control requirements. It's just like the old thing, DDD question, how do we communicate with the stakeholders? Can we put the domain language, the ubiquitous language, somehow into the code or not? And usually I would say that the provable systems are not that well suited to in the context of a ubiquitous language.
Gotcha.
So that's the trade-off, right? Still, we try to tackle that with the kind of testing tools we provide.
Yeah. Which in a way is, it's not provable in a sense that you can sit down and prove it, but in a sense it is because of the testing. You can kind of see how it's performing and doing. So really great. And thank you for making this complex and abstract topic in a way very practical and very easy to follow and understand. I appreciate that. To close off the discussion, though, I wanted to kind of go back to what we were talking a little bit ago about your relationship with Axon, and you're one of our partners, which is really amazing. Can you tell our audience a little bit about your consultancy services, maybe, and also what kind of partnership you have with us?
Yeah, so we're not a solution provider. So the kind of partnership we have with Axon is really to be I think one of your employees called it as being a friendly face to to act for people trying to use Axon in their development environment and their applications, to have somebody who is a sparring partner and looking at their requirements, how to tackle these problems, how to structure it, to have a sparring partner really to talk about this.
Yes.
Also, we can provide service in the area of proof of concept development and doing reviews. And also, one of the main areas I'm active right now in is training teams in using Axon in practice. So getting them up to speed, and also doing beyond just the training we can do with Axon Academy and the kind of training material we have there. Really get into the practice and getting your fingers dirty and actually write some code and work with them, setting up the things and show where some typical pitfalls would be in developing your Axon applications. So it's really not big solution development that we're doing right now. We're doing that internally to a certain degree. We're really helping teams to work in the, let's call it the Axon ecosystem. And of course, we can help with these kinds of security issues as well with access control in Axon and other frameworks. Maybe I can do one shameless plug here in the end.
Of course,
because I would like to mention that all the stuff I've been talking about is available as open source, and you can go to sapl.io to find out all about the project. There will be some blogs and tutorials. You can find a demo project for the Axon integration on our GitHub repository, and the licensing of the core engine and everything I've been talking about so far is Apache 2.0 licensing. So there's a low barrier of entry. And Amelie, we are looking forward to hear from you. And maybe you want to join us on our Discord server for the project, which is also linked on the SAPL side. Other than that, I've been enjoying my time very much here on the podcast.
Thank you.
And
thank you so much for mentioning that. Yeah, absolutely. Everybody go check it out and try it out and let Dominic know what you think. And thank you so much again. Have a great day and talk to you soon.
Sarah, bye.
I hope you enjoyed the talk about attribute-based access control as much as I did. Please join me next time for other great conversations. Until then, have a great time and happy coding.